We're going to start with our third and final panel of the day of Adventive America. The third panel is entitled Home, and it will be moderated by our faculty member, the Arthur Gordon Assistant Professor, Azzurra Cox. Azzurra Cox is a registered landscape architect and writer interested in the power of landscapes to shape and reflect collective narratives. During her 6 years of practice at GGN, she worked on urban scale projects across the country, including San Francisco's India Basin Shoreline Park. Azzurra explores how both the process and product of landscape architecture can deepen relationships between communities and their places, and in so doing can amplify existing power, lift up layered histories, and spur grounded activism. Azzurra brings a range of experiences in the worlds of publishing, curation, and design activism to her practice and research, which centers the myths and memories that live and are expressed in the land. So welcome, Azzurra, and we'll bring you up to introduce our third and final panel, Home. Thanks.
Let's go in. Hello, everyone. Excited to be here. I'm going to be introducing our final panel on home. And just starting, by saying a few words about the theme. So the English word home is from the Old English word ham, not ham, ham, which refers to a village or estate. In other words, not the sort of more private inward-facing notion that we have that is perhaps a hangover from post-war suburbia, but home as a space of plurality, of gathering, a world of its own. Indeed, the concept of home easily transcends scales. It can be a patch of dirt, it can be a nook in a tree, it can be an abode, it can be the walls of an abode, it can be the planet. So if our homes are made of who and what we gather there, our family, our heirlooms, our memories, plants are intimately woven into this fabric. For me personally, home might be where the heart is, but it's definitely where the progeny of my all-time favorite roommate, a giant and generous Monstera plant. Maybe Monstera plants are actually an adventive species in their own way, which I tended for years in Seattle, resides and will always reside. Sort of the progeny will kind of keep coming with me to whatever home I have. So our next speakers will tell stories of the species we gather as we define and redefine our notions of home, and how these adventive species not only root us in place, but connect us across geographies and generations. So we'll start it off with Tessa Desmond, who is a scholar and a farmer. She is a research specialist focusing on food and agriculture at Princeton University in the School of Public and International Affairs. She also directs the seed farm at Princeton, co-leads the Princeton Food Project, and serves as co-principal investigator for the Heirloom Gardens Oral History Project. Additionally, she's a founding member of the Ujamaa Cooperative Farming Alliance and serves on the boards of Native Roots Farm Foundation. Tessa earned her PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she was trained as a literary critic with special emphasis on stories of race and diaspora. Desmond's work is interdisciplinary, using the tools of oral history, as well as literary and narrative analysis to document the ways in which food and farming serve as carriers of culture, and to understand the role that food has played in racial, ethnic, and social identity for generations. I will just add that Tessa is one of the authors in the upcoming issue of LA Plus, which I'm guest editing on memory. She's co-writing, or she has co-written an essay with a few of her collaborators. And much of Tessa's current work deals specifically with seeds, seed stories, and the way that narratives attached to seeds carry history and important cultural lessons, while they also support the preservation of agrobiodiversity. And then second speaker will be Mitchem Hansen, who is an anthropologist and archaeologist whose research interests include environmental history, science studies, and multi-species studies. Her dissertation explores these topics in the context of the people, plants, and animals at Bartram's Garden in Philadelphia. And then we'll close it off with Shurui Zhang, who is a designer, researcher, and educator whose work examines migration through a more than human lens, focusing on the co-migration of diasporic communities and the plants that sustain them. Her professional experience spans government and private practice, including work on the Virginia Coastal Resilience Master Plan and urban design projects at WXY Architecture and Urban Design. Zhang's current research examines Chinese diasporic urbanism in Flushing, investigating how immigrant communities reshape spatial narratives through everyday practices and adopt care as a framework to sustain cultural identities. Shurui recently taught here at the University of Pennsylvania. So let's welcome Tessa up to the podium.
Thank you. Thanks, Azzurra. Thanks, Catherine, and everybody who's put this event together. You put together such thoughtful, productively playful programs, and I'm honored that I'm a drive away, so I get to take part sometimes. The work that I'm going to share today is a collaborative effort. A version of it will appear in a forthcoming collection called Seedsinius that's being edited by Helen Curry. And the project and part of this paper has been co-authored by Courtney Street and Nate Kleinman, who you'll meet through the presentation. But I give honor and collaborative credit all around. So I want to tell you the story of the Maycock squash. So we're going to talk about restoring and revitalizing the Maycock squash in Lenape-Hoking. And I will point out that Cleo reminded me that the Maycock squash was grown here on campus in the garden that's tied to the health services, right? In the undergrad dorm. So last year I was able to share a package of the Maycock seeds, and Cleo grew them. So, all right. So our story starts in the 1980s, but has been generations in the making. It begins something like this. Seed steward William Wise Weaver, curator of the Roughwood Seed Collection, gave a talk on heirloom seeds at a public library in Mullica Hills, New Jersey. Weaver asked the audience to bring seeds. And at the end of the event, a Nanticoke woman named Fanny Johnson approached Weaver to share her seeds. She called them Maycock squash, and as Johnson handed Weaver the seeds, she asked him to care for them. Weaver grew the seeds occasionally over the next 3 decades before sharing them with co-author and founder of the Experimental Farm Network in 2019, Nate Kleinman. The seeds Kleinman received were separated into several envelopes with descriptive labels such as blocky yellow and rigid white. Weaver explained that he had received a diverse landrace and had been working gradually to isolate individual types from the original population. Landraces are local varieties of plants that have unique characteristics which have developed over time in response to the geography and environmental conditions where they grow. They're enduring and ancestral collections of important crop-level traits. This is very different than our very stable, narrow varieties, right? So this is the Maycock squash in all of its iterations. Landrace varieties can be centuries in the making and bear the names of region or people for which they originated. The hallmark of a landrace crop is its diversity in shape, size, color, maturation, nutritional value, flavor, and environmental adaptations, among other possible traits. The population is valued for its diversity, which is beneficial for the resilience of the crop because disease or pests may impact some, but not all, of the plants in a field. As the botanist and plant breeder Anton Zevin describes, whether the varying abiotic and biotic stress for each plant, one or more genotypes within the landrace population will yield satisfactory. Landraces were and still are grown by farmers, market, and private gardeners all over the world for this reason, end quote. Pinning down the definition of a landrace can be difficult. The term is sometimes used inappropriately to describe plant family lines that are not yet stable varieties, or that are the result of more recent crosses. And such uses of the term in that way obscure the temporal significance of a landrace's adaptation over time to the place that it grows, and the selection over time by the people who grow it. Landraces are in vivo, with the life. They're in vivo collections of plant germplasm, and as such, the diversity contained in a landrace is an essential tool for adaptation and the plant's survival. In January 2023, Kleinman introduced the Maycock squash to Courtney Street, who's pictured here on your left, and Corel Hall, who's pictured on the right, members of the Nanticoke community and leaders at Native Roots Farm Foundation. Hall, on the right, is a linguistic expert working to revitalize the Nanticoke language. And she noted, Maycock. That sounds like Makahawk, the Nanticoke word for squash. Essentially, it's a squash in the Nanticoke language. That sparked the linguistic connection of Maycock with Mahawkok, along with the origin story that included Fanny Johnson, a Nanticoke elder, incited the collaboration between our organizations. Together, we're working to revitalize the Maycock squash with its original Nanticoke people across its original homelands in the areas now known as Delaware, Maryland, and New Jersey. We've been growing the Maycock squash for the past 3 years with support of our organizations, the Experimental Farm Network, Native Roots Farm Foundation, the one I lead, the Seed Farm at Princeton, and the Ujamaa Cooperative Farming Alliance. Our goal is to restore the Maycock as a diverse landrace squash. So to take blocky white, rigid yellow, and put them all back together. And to revitalize the relationships of Indigenous people in this region with their ancestral crop. There's no road work for the work that we're doing. It involves tracing stories, crop genetics, and foodways that have been obscured by time, memory, colonization, and trauma. Through our work with the Maycock, we are charting a path or developing a method that recognizes, reclaims, and celebrates Indigenous plant wisdom. On our journey, we've encountered at least as many questions as we have answers. And in this essay, we reflect on each of the components of our collaborative work, the stories, the genetics, and the foodways. Stories. The story that we inherited with the seeds, that of Fanny Johnson and William Moyes Weaver, has defining details that we thought would make it easy to verify. However, co-author Street has found it difficult to locate Fanny Johnson among Nanticoke family lines, not because there's no record of Fanny Johnson, but because there are several Fanny Johnsons. And Street has inquired with elders and kinship networks among the various Fanny Johnsons, but her relatives have not yet been identified. Despite having the name of the elder seed steward, we have no information about her beyond that single encounter between Weaver and Johnson. This leaves many questions about Fanny Johnson and her seeds unanswered. How old was Johnson at the time that she shared the seeds? When did she pass on from this world? When was the last time that she had grown the squash, and what was her experience growing these plants? Who gave her the seeds? What was the story that was shared with her when she received the seeds? And what was the composition of the original population when she started growing it? We may never have the answers to these questions. Another part of the story that remains difficult to verify or fully understand is Weaver's work with the seeds, and especially the degree to which his selections changed the original Maycock population. How many rounds of selections did he do? How much did his selection diverge from the original seeds that he received? And did he select certain traits or types out of the population such that they no longer appeared among his seeds? And how many selections were made that Weaver did not include in his gift to Kleinman? At least one Weaver selection called Tall White Maycock was not given to Kleinman by Weaver. Instead, Kleinman acquired it from a friend who had received it from a former employee of Weaver. And this is how the seed world works. Therefore, we're left wondering, are there segments of the population that are missing that contain traits which are now lost? The next major component of questions that we're asking are around genetics. So using contemporary genetic tools, we could answer our questions about phenotypic selection to some degree, and likely many others. But we have prioritized developing our own relationships with the Maycock before engaging in genetic analysis. We've decided to grow the crop for several seasons so that we can see how it behaves, cross-pollinates, and changes, to cook and taste it, noting the differences in textures and flavor profiles across the phenotypes, and to understand the broad scope of the population. Only later may we possibly start incorporating genetic data? If we were pursuing this project from a purely scientific standpoint, we could probably deploy genetic analysis from the start and learn as much as possible about the Maquok, but that would be controversial at best in the communities in which we live and work. It also seems unnecessary right now. There are things that we could know, which we are choosing not to know, so that we can allow for a process of wonder and connection to unfold. While working with a landrace, wonder comes pretty easy because each plant is unique. This is the hallmark of the landrace, as I've said, high phenotypic diversity. A landrace, like the Maquok, encompasses a more specific population than a crop species. So the Maquok is in the crop species, Cucurbita pepo, but it's more diverse than a typical cultivar or variety, like the named variety yellow crookneck. We believe that crooknecks and patty pans may have descended from the Maquok line, as they're known to be from the same region, and both types show up in the Maquok population. However, a field of Maquoks will also display traits of many other varieties of sea pepo, for example, the shape of an acorn squash. The importance of working with the Maquok as a landrace is further underscored by the fact that sea pepo is among the very oldest of all domesticates in eastern North American agriculture, antedating maize and winter squash in this region by thousands of years. To support wonder and encourage everyone in the garden to see the crop with new eyes, we avoid predetermined taxonomies at this stage, and instead we let everyone name what they see. So over the last 3 seasons, the Maquoks in our gardens have been variously described as cylindrical, oval, or tubular. They've been described with varying shades across sunshine yellow, creamy yellow, white, green, variegated, and gradual. They're warty or smooth. One observer's spaceship shaped is another's Hershey kiss. These characteristics are combinatory. For example, there are yellow spaceships and white ones, and some have warts, while others do not. And one growing season, we sorted the varieties into 23 different labeled phenotypes, which we processed for seed. We stored these separately so that we can intentionally mix the phenotypes together the following season, and that is the package that I gave to Cleo, which had 46 seeds, 2 of each of the phenotypes that we had seen. Foodways. As our familiarity with the Maquok increases, so too does our interest in understanding how it fit into past foodways. The only notable fact about the Maquok passed on to Weaver by Johnson was that it was traditionally cut into thin spirals and dried for winter use. The loss of many traditional Nanticoke foods and ancestral foodways makes it difficult to uncover more. Beginning in 1608, Nanticoke people's connections to plants, land, and culture were damaged by European colonization. Colonists committed devastating acts of cultural genocide. They terrorized the Nanticoke people by deforesting hunting grounds, attacking and barricading tribal members onto reservations, and intentionally disconnecting the community from the natural world. In losing access to nature and being forcibly assimilated into mainstream society, many aspects of Nanticoke culture were disrupted or lost, including access to foods, language, traditions, and relationships with plants, including squash. As we recover the history of the Maquok, we also have to contend with these traumas. In practice, this has meant prioritizing and honoring in a very special way the relationship of Nanticoke people with the Maquok. Native Roots Farm Foundation is leading the relational work among Nanticoke people by sharing Maquok seedlings and seeds at powwows and other Native gatherings in the Mid-Atlantic. NRFF also hosts an annual lunch for volunteers and community members who grow the plants in their gardens and their yards. And NRFF shares this ancestral fruit along with modern recipes and practical cooking techniques to help tribal members reincorporate Maquok squash into their diets. In discussions with elders and community members at these gatherings and the annual lunch, we've collected what is known about traditional foodways for the Nanticoke people. Street has used that information to reconstruct a narrative and offer a hypothesis for how the Maquok may have fit into the historical Nanticoke culture. This is Street's summation. The word Nanticoke translates to the Tidewater people. It illustrates the Nanticoke Indian tribe's deeply rooted relationship with the natural world between the Delaware and Chesapeake Bays. This connection to place varied by season. During the colder months, the community lived in the woodlands near hunting and trapping sites, and in the warmer months, the Nanticoke moved to waterways where they fished, foraged, and farmed. In their summer hockey hakans, which is the Lenape word for garden or field, the Nanticoke cultivated and nurtured diverse plant varieties. This includes squash that could have been maycock. When ripe and tender, many squash were cut into rings and dried. This process would have made the maycock light, compact, and easy to carry, so they could be packed on the Nanticoke people's migration back to the woodlands in the winter. Throughout the colder months, these dried strips could be rejuvenated with a quick soak or boiling. After our first season growing together, we were invited to present at the Variety Showcase at Glenwood Center for Regional Farming in New York, an event hosted by the Culinary Breeding Network. Co-author Desmond, that's me, harvested ripe squash with her students at the seed farm at Princeton. Kleinman led a workshop in which students spiralized the squash and hung them to dry in the traditional method. And then Street and her uncle, Rashid Abdurrahman, a chef, rehydrated the squash as part of a Three Sisters soup for the event. The Nanticoke people gifted the world something truly special in the maycock squash, which may at least be partly responsible for not just yellow crooknecks and patty pans, but also spaghetti squash and even zucchini. That maycock still exists at all, and that it carries the same name it had when the last fluent native Nanticoke speaker passed on, Lydia Clark, in 1856, feels almost too good to be true, borderline miraculous. Yet the maycock's staggering diversity, paired with repeated morphological similarities, all the plants and fruits are different, but nevertheless variations on a theme. It testifies to it being a true land race. It's part of a long, deep story tracing back thousands of years that reminds us of the value of scaling our gardens bigger than single varieties. Land races invite us to think about our fields as both larders and gene banks that can serve diverse functions for community scale food provision, plant adaptation, and resilience. We will never know all of the maycock's secrets, but we're immensely grateful to be getting to know this plant and its teachings. If you want to learn more about or from Native Roots Farm Foundation's work on Indigenous plants and the work that they're doing to revitalize our connections with them here in Lenape-Hoking, you can check out their project. This project was developed for the 250th anniversary of the founding of the state of Delaware, which also coincides with our theme. And the project is called The Place Where Plants Grow. The project has developed this map of the region. You'll notice there are no state boundaries on it, which makes it, in my view, really gorgeous. And on it, they've noted particularly valued plant relatives in both their English and Unami names. Unami is one of the dialects of the Lenape people. There's a QR code to learn more about the plants, and you can hear the pronunciation of the names in this one indigenous language that names them, although they have many names in many places. So here's an example of the strawberry, which is tehem, and if you want to click the QR code, please go right ahead. Otherwise, nativerootsde.org/theplace. And this is a list of our collaborators and my email if you want to talk about any of this later. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak here today. Thank you to all the other speakers and everyone who has put this event together. It's been really lovely. It's also fortuitously been great to go towards the end of the day because a lot of the things I'm going to talk about have been sort of previewed already. So for those of you who are here this morning, you will have already heard a little bit about Bartram's Garden. I'm going to talk more in detail on that today. And I'm also going to talk about the archaeobotany at Bartram's Garden, which Chantel has done a wonderful job of laying the groundwork for me. Bartram's Garden is here in Philadelphia. I do encourage you all to visit it if you haven't been there before. It's a really beautiful space. They have wonderful community programming. It's currently a park jointly owned by the city and the John Bartram Association. And as Professor Farmer mentioned earlier, it is sometimes considered to be the oldest botanic garden in what is now North America. While living there, the Bartram family grew plants from around the now United States and also the wider world. But the plants that I want to talk about today on the theme of home are the food plants that would have been grown at the garden, and I want to think about who those plants ask us to consider. So, writing about an assemblage of artifacts recovered from Bacon's Castle in Surrey County, Virginia, archaeologist Rebecca Planto asks how cast-offs from everyday life index, in the Percy and Sons, the people who lived and labored on the property. And indexes, while not direct representations, point towards what or whom they signify. So, in other words, who is signified by the plants that were grown at Bartram's garden? And again, I think as Chantel's talk demonstrated earlier, archaeology is particularly well suited to answering these kinds of questions. So, for over 150 years, 4 generations of the Bartram family and their laborers lived and worked at the garden. John Bartram was an excommunicated Quaker farmer who became a self-trained, in scare quotes, botanist and naturalist, and he and his son William, who we heard about in the context of the Lewis and Clark expedition, undertook numerous natural collection journeys along the east coast of the American colonies, later the United States. Through contacts with merchants in London, they ran a profitable seed and plant clipping business, as at the time plant species grown in their garden were considered exotic and desirable by European landscapers, collectors, and scientists. Later on, under John's granddaughter, Anne Bartram Carr, and her husband Robert, this is into the 19th century, the garden went on to sell plant clippings, including hybrid flowers, to Americans, and at one point opened their garden for public visitation. And then financial difficulties resulted in the family selling the property in 1850. So John Bartram was called, perhaps erroneously, the, quote, greatest natural botanist in the world by Carl Linnaeus. And in many ways, Bartram's garden was an epicenter of natural history in the colonies and later the early American Republic. The garden was visited by George Washington, which this visit is recreated much after the fact in this picture, but also Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and Andrew Michaud. But Bartram's garden was also a household, and the plants that would have been grown there were not only for sale or grown as a part of scientific discovery, but also to feed the family, to medicate the family. So how can looking at Bartram's garden, and here I mean both the house itself and the surrounding lands, and the plants that were utilized therein, afford us the opportunity to think about who might have been a part of that household? So John Bartram's famous garden was likely preceded by a kitchen garden. So kitchen gardens were essential for supplementing food bought at market and keeping families fed in the 18th century. These were common features of colonial homes, and they would have been one of the first horticultural undertakings on new properties. Writing in 1744 to Peter Collinson, John Bartram wrote, "I'm heartily obliged to thy gardener friend for his kind endeavors. Yet I am sorry he sent me such large quantity of seeds that might have fetched him something considerable in London, which to me signified very little, for we have great plenty of such things in almost every kitchen garden." The beginnings of his own kitchen garden are recorded in a 1759 letter, where he states, "I have had a root growing in my kitchen garden about 30 years, placing the initial planting of this garden at least 1729, a year after he bought the property." So I am a historical archaeologist by training, which means I combine written and material sources to ask questions about the past. And in the case of this project, I use the extensive writings of the Bartrams and their contemporaries, as well as archaeobotanical data. So we heard a little bit about this earlier, but I'm just going to go into a little bit of detail. Many creatures considered commensal or pest species, including rodents, birds, and insects, gather plants for food. By reconstructing the foraging range and the time period over which these creatures were foraging, we can infer which human activities these plant remains represent. So a vital source of information comes from plant material found in the attic of the Bartram family home. In 1977, the John M. Dickey architecture firm of Media, Pennsylvania, was hired to undertake repair work on the historic Bartram home. In the north and westernmost room on the third floor attic, the architects uncovered a large amount of rodent-collected materials hidden under the floorboards, including many historic plant specimens such as seeds and nutshells. So, while birds, rodents, and insects all cache plant materials under different circumstances, rodent nests in particular consist overwhelmingly of floral material, like this assemblage. And I have a picture of this in a little bit. You can also see traces of rodent gnaw marks on some of the specimens. Other characteristics of the material indicated one rodent in particular, the black rat. So, I used a couple of lines of evidence to determine a probable date range. So, firstly, since the material was recovered from a standing structure, the date of the structure's construction is the earliest possible date. So the Bartram family home was built in phases, beginning as a two-room stone parlor in 1728. In the mid-1740s, the house was expanded to include a new kitchen on the northern end, and sometime in the late 1750s to 1770s, a pantry was added to the east side of the kitchen. Around this time, the third-story attic began expanding to the north and east as well. These decades of work ended with the construction of a new facade, which necessitated major reframing and re-roofing of the completed house block. The completion year of 1770 is an estimate based on the date John Bartram carves into a stone lintel on the front of the house. But given this evidence, it's clear that the rodent assemblage, so this rat's nest and the plants contained therein, did not predate the Bartram family's occupation of the property. So, for instance, it is not indicative of the earlier Swedish settlers who lived on this site. So the assemblage was, here's my picture of the gnaw marks. So the assemblage was also dated using associated artifacts found within the rat's nesting. So some of the paper found within the rat's nest were newspaper and map fragments. So in the 18th and the 19th century, typeface and newspaper cycled in and out of fashion fairly quickly. So their presence and the combination of the presence of different typefaces is actually pretty diagnostic. Text scraps from the attic assemblage contain both Caslon and heavy Roman fatface, and these overlapped in the late 17 and early 1800s. And then after 1858, Caslon does become popular again. A second overlap takes place, but I think for a variety of reasons, this probably indicates the earlier overlap. So with assistance from Dr. Mishraz here at the Kislak Center, we were actually able to match some of the newspaper fragments through the America's Historical Newspaper Database. One is from Dunlap's Daily Advertiser on January 27th, 1791, and one is from the Aurora General Advertiser, which would have ran sometime between June 27th and July 5th, 1806. Both of these newspapers were local publications, meaning that it is likely that they had relatively short circulation lives and were cached relatively recently to when they were published. So, what do these plants, which were contemporary to the Bartram family's occupation of the property, tell us? So black rats are opportunistic foragers, and they have relatively small foraging ranges, up to 150 feet, with 100 feet being more likely. If resources are plentiful enough, they prefer to forage and nest in separate parts of their home range and will actually take food back to their nests as surplus to store for later. So this means that the plants in the attic space would have been within 150 feet of the attic. And so on the left here, you can see an image The star represents the part of the Bartram house that these plants were found in. The inner circle is 100 feet. The outer circle is 150 feet. The figure on the right is one of the only maps of Bartram's garden contemporary to the Bartram family's occupation. It was drawn in 1758 by William Bartram, who labels some of the garden beds, and I've copied those names onto the map of the left. So as you can see, the kitchen garden, part of the greenhouse complex, and the new flower garden would have been well within the rodents' foraging range, as well as any food storage happening within the home. So this is just an image to show you, as sorting happened, what some of the plants looked like as they were being identified. And I just wanted to show you this before I show you a couple of graphs, because I think graphs are helpful, but sometimes a little opaque. So these graphs, I'm going to show you this one and then one that is the remains by count, give you a sense of the makeup of the larger assemblage. And you can see how things look if we divide them into sort of general categories of agricultural fields, kitchen gardens, medicinal plants, and other cultivated taxa. Obviously, many of these plants could belong in more than one category, and I don't think rats particularly cared about which category they belonged in, but this gives us a way to start to talk about them. Here's the same data set by count. Note that it's pretty similar. Kitchen garden crops feature a little bit more heavily here. So I want to comment on the two most prevalent categories, trees and woody shrubs, and agricultural fields, parentheses, kitchen garden. So trees native to North America were extremely important to the Bartram business, particularly at the beginning. In addition to direct orders via letters or visits to the garden, the Bartram family released 8 broadsides or order sheets to advertise plants for sale between 1751 and 1836. The first 2 broadsides are entirely composed of trees and shrubs native to North America. In other words, these taxa were the jumping off point for the Bartram business. Tree species identified by their preserved seed or fruit in the Bartram Attic Botanical Assemblage and also listed for sale in the broadsides include native North American species of oak, walnut, and hickory. John and William brought many species from their North American travels back to Philadelphia to grow in their garden, and John's letters to interested European buyers attest that North American trees such as magnolias were lucrative parts of the family business. The Bartrams also grew orchard trees to sell to customers who wished to grow fruit, as well as for consumption by the family. So the second largest category are food crops. So thinking about these crops asks us to think about many of the themes that we have discussed here today, one being empire. Natural history and botanical discovery painted the natural world at the periphery of the European Empire as unknown but knowable. The project of empire needed plants in more ways than just conceptually, though. Plants were critical as food and medicine for settlers, and knowing which familiar European plants could be grown in the New World, again quotes, was important. In 1785, William Bartram sends a document, and possibly some plant samples, we don't know, to a satellite branch of the Jardin du Roi near Rambouillet in France. The plants he mentions in this document were grown by the Bartram family. They include bread wheat, buckwheat, millet, beans, parsnips, and peppers. And I apologize, I have most of these things pictured, but not all of them. And the project of empire was not just about exporting European crops, but also about importing and incorporating indigenous foods from around the world. So in the attic, rats took advantage of this. Their nests contained maize or corn, foxgrape, American wild plums, and American persimmons, which index native North American foodways. I don't have any maycock squash, but I do have other types of squash. There are also plants from other colonized areas outside of what is now North America, including one seed that may be watermelon, which equally cryptically, the Bartrams may have been growing in their garden. Also present are peanuts and Brazil nuts, both foods originally from Central and South America. Interestingly, the Bartrams do not write of growing these foods at their garden, but their archaeobotanical presence doesn't mean that they were grown there. Both of those foods were somewhat popular snack foods in the late 18th and early 19th centuries in Philadelphia. And these plants are important on both the South American and African contexts. And they index the fact that there were people from there passing in and through Philadelphia. So I hope that I am being clear that the presence of things like maize or peanuts or watermelon do not point to any particular indigenous person or even community at this site. We do know that Bartram's Garden is on Lenapehoking, and that the site was home to the Lenape long before they were displaced by European colonizers. Right? We also know that Philadelphia was built in part using enslaved labor, and that there may or may not have been enslaved. There were certainly indentured workers at Bartram's Garden. But what I hope that these plants indicate, rather, is that this garden, and really every garden, did not and cannot exist in a vacuum. In the case of these attic plants, I think they ask us to think about the people who were involved in the story of Bartram's Garden beyond the Bartram family. And I think that particularly today, and I'm thinking about what took place at Independence Mall the other week, it's really important that we think about all the people who have been involved in our stories. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here today. It's having a very amazing day. I'm here today to tell you a story about soybeans and how soybean became an American crop. So soybean has been in the news in its price experienced unusual volatility last year because of the uncertainty with Chinese import. And last week, China just agreed to purchase 12 million metric tons of soybean from the US, sending the price higher from a multi-month decline. And the United States produces more than 1/3 of the world's soybean, and it's the second largest of soybean producer in the world, and just second after Brazil, which only exceeds the US by 2%. For about half of the soybean production in the US exports to China. Now, because of this won't-they relationship between China and America, China pivoted its soybean imports to South American countries like Argentina and Brazil instead, impacting many farmers in the US. Soybean takes more than 20% of total cropland in the United States. The area is about equal to 2.5 of the states of Philadelphia. Yet soybean is not native in America. It's native in East Asia, and it has been a staple crop in Chinese culture for thousands of years. So how did we get here? How did American domesticate soybean after it's already been domesticated in China for thousands of years? And how did soybean make American its home? So the Latin name for soybean is glycine max. It's a nitrogen fixer. It's an ideal crop for crop rotation. The earliest archaeology record of cultivated soybean can be found in northern China for around 3,000 years ago. Soybean is deeply embedded in Chinese culture, as we can find countless mention of soybean in ancient literatures. And this is Shijing, which is the oldest collection in China, a collection of poetry in China dates back to the 11th century BC. And here it was written as Shu, that's highlighted. So the character Shu on the left, this is an ancient pictograph of the character. It's depicting the action of picking up a soybean. So there's a person on the right, and the left is the plant, and the 3 dots on the bottom are the beans that's dropped on the ground. Yeah. And the quote that I had over here is actually saying that there is a prince, and he is very stupid because he cannot tell the difference between soybean and wheat, so he is not fit for the throne. And then later in 2nd century BC, people start to adopt dough as a character to describe the plant instead. The character dough here, as written here, is used to be a container used by royalties from the Qin dynasty, and since the dynasty declined, the etiquette declined with the dynasty, so the container was adopted to describe the plant instead. Oh, the container was used to be like, I think it was used to be used to put fermented soybeans in. So when did soybean come to America? There are a couple of accounts, and one of the earliest is actually a letter by Benjamin Franklin to John Bartram here in Philadelphia in 1770. Franklin sent some seeds of soybean from Europe to Bartram and describe it as a Chinese garbanzos, that a cheese can be made from them, and that called tofu. We don't have an English word for tofu just yet, and the soybean was also not called soybean until 1804. The first record of planting of soybean on American soil is actually a few years earlier. So it was in 1765, a surveyor in Savannah, Georgia, planted soybean brought by a sailor named Samuel Bowen. Bowen was an English sailor who have sailed with the East India Company, and he went to China and he acquired the soybean seeds there and brought them back to the U.S. And in his letter, is quote here, he described how versatile these beans are. He says that they can be prepared into a type of vermicelli, and the plants can be used as animal feeds. Also, the sprouts are edible. And Bowen later received a gold medal from the Royal Society of Arts in Britain for his findings on soybeans' multiple use. He also received quite some money from the king for a patent to make soybean noodles, and that's a record of his patent. In 1769, Samuel Bowen was elected to be a member of American Philosophical Society for the promotion of useful arts here in Philadelphia for his discovery on soybeans. In Samuel Bowen's description, soybean is something that he discovered during his trip to China and discovered the uses of and later made a profit from. For many Europeans, China is mystical and magical, but passive and stuck in the past, with bountiful resources for Westerners to discover, but it was simply not true. Samuel Bowen took soybean from Canton, which was a vibrant port in China that opened to the foreigners since the mid-18th century. For about 100 years, Chinese merchants and artisans actively participated in trades with the Europeans. High quantity of objects and paintings were exported to Europe, and they were produced in Canton for the sole purpose of export. So in this image, you see the port and the warehouses of Canton, and on the right are two books that teaches English, and they're published in Canton. And you can either translate them as a language of the red-haired foreigners or language of the red-haired barbarians. It kind of depends on the context. Okay, and this painting of a soybean is part of a trade painting collection. It's produced by Chinese artists for sales to the Western customers. And it's in this painting, the plant is isolated against a white background, a style akin to earlier European botanical illustration. To participate in global trade, Chinese people sold this fantastical but flattened version of Chinese culture to the European onlookers. And these images and objects made Chinese culture legible and consumable. This is the first step for soybean to take roots in American soil. By imagining China as a magical but pre-modern land, Western observers positioned themselves as modernizers entitled to commercialize its botanical knowledge. So soybean remained a marginal crop since its introduction. In the early 1900s, USDA, the Department of Agriculture, sent explorer Frank Meyer to China, who collected several varieties of soybean. Soybean were studied in labs, but it was never considered as a major food source. It was primarily grown either to process into soy sauce to export to Europe or as an animal feed. Black agriculturalists like George Washington Carver understood soybeans' potential to fertilize soil, so he studied soybean for its ability to restore depleted soil in the 1910s. And he also identified soybean as a crop that's suited for American South. Carver pushed for rotational cropping with legume plants such as soybean and peanuts, since many black farmers was not able to acquire good quality land due to Jim Crow laws. But despite these efforts, there was never a domestic market to consume soybean as food, other than its industrial use. So during World War I, the U.S. government feared that the war would disrupt the meat supply for both the military and the American public. Soybeans plant protein was considered potentially a perfect substitute. So to help Americans develop a taste for soybean foods, the USDA commissioned a Chinese woman, Dr. Ya Meiqin, for the task. Ya Meiqin was born in China. She was orphaned, and then she was adopted by 2 American missionaries. She attended New York Infirmary for Women and Children when she was 16, and she was the first Chinese woman who earned a U.S. medical degree. Dr. Qin spent many years traveling between Asia and America, and in China, she promoted Western knowledge, Western medical knowledge, and founded the first nursing school in Tianjin, I want to say, in 1907. In the US, she visited many places, giving lectures on Chinese politics, food and culture, and the women's movement at the time in China. She wore traditional clothes and speak perfect English, so it's a very astonishing thing for many Americans at the time. When she came back to the US in 1917, she established a kitchen within the USDA Bureau of Chemistry. She created soybean-based dishes for American taste, entrees made with bean curds and cream mushrooms, salads with bean sprouts, and chocolate pudding with tofu. People who have tasted them all spoke very highly of the taste. And Ya Meiqin herself was a great food connoisseur and a fantastic cook. In China, she was famous for her dinner parties with delicious foods. But however, America was not receptive to soybean foods, and the funding for Dr. Qin's project was slashed, and she eventually returned to China for good and continued to practice medicine there. She did all of her work during the Chinese Exclusion Act. In 1882, the first Chinese Exclusion Act was passed to prevent Chinese labor coming to the U.S. The same year, Ya Mei attended medical school in New York. The letter from Teddy Roosevelt is a very sympathetic rejection of her becoming a U.S. citizen, because as president, he has no power over the congressional act. Congress made the Chinese Exclusion Act permanent, and it was not repealed until 1943, 25 years after Ya Meiqin left America. In 1902, to extend the Chinese Exclusion Act, the American Federation of Labor published a pamphlet titled Some Reasons for Chinese Exclusion, Meat versus Rice, American Manhood Against Asiatic Coolism, Which Shall Survive. It's a very dramatic title. In this pamphlet, Chinese labor were portrayed as industrious but mindless, resilient but deviant, and ultimately unassimilable. Ironically, the very quality that made them desirable for American capital is exactly the same quality that justified their exclusion. Working class people were pitted against each other through the invention of a racial hierarchy. These faceless Chinamen can work tirelessly while survive on minimal foods are framed as dangerous because they undercut the wages of white laborers. Chinese diet must be undesirable. Plant-based eating is associated with weakness, passivity, and feminization, in opposition to ideals of American manhood. This is a quote in the pamphlet from Senator James Blaine. He says, in quote, in all such conflicts and in all such struggle, the result is not to bring up the men who live on rice to the beef and bread standard, but it is to bring down the beef and bread men to the rice standard. Interestingly, this rhetoric stands in contrast with Micchem's observation. What she said, the chief reason why people can live so cheaply in China and yet produce for that nation a manpower so tremendous that this country must pass an exclusion act against them is that they eat beans instead of meat. The plant-based diet of Chinese worker is framed simultaneously as a threat for blame, but also a source of power for Dr. Kim. In a way, both of them recognize that the entanglement between food and bodies, what people eat, can affect their bodies. However, Blaine was fearful, so he thought to stabilize and racialize the diet to ensure segregation. While Mitchem understood that food is transformative and the bodily differences is contingent rather than fixed. So, if soybean were a symbol of cultural inferiority, what eventually made it acceptable as an American crop? The production of soybean did not start to take off until the World War II. At the time, China was still the largest producer of soybean in the world, but the war with Japan severely disrupted the Chinese agriculture. U.S. needed soybean both for domestic use and for export to allied countries. At the time, America also had a cotton problem. So cotton production in the South relied on coarse labor like sharecropping after the Civil War. Over the years, due to environmental degradation and the Black farmers' rights movement, the southern states can no longer rely on cotton for consistent profit. Soybean appeared to be an ideal alternative. It could tolerate harsh conditions and offer stable return, especially after adapted to mechanized farming. The issue now is how to create a sufficient market and how to incentivize farmers to grow soybeans. To create a market, there's consistent push by the USDA. There were posters, pamphlets, cookbooks that appeal to investors, farmers, and consumers. Soybean appeared in stalls in the Patriotic Food Show in Chicago in 1918. Soybean meals were featured in its official cookbook. The name is Win the War Cookbook, and it was rebranded as healthy and economic. Soybean shed its Chinese heritage. Growing and consuming soybean is patriotic, aligned with national duty. On the production side, USDA offered farmer loans and farming equipment. Many states' agriculture experimental station also started to develop soybean varieties that could be suitable for climates in the South and sturdy enough for machine harvesting. In the 50s, agriculturalist Edgar Hartwig developed a new variety named the Lee that can do just that. Dr. Hartwig developed more than 20 varieties of soybean over his lifetime and was known as the father of soybean in the South. Out of all of his varieties, more than half are named after Confederate generals, names including Lee, Jackson, Pace, Hardee, and Dowling. His naming practice was notably different from earlier USDA conventions. So in the early 1900s, soybean cultivar were usually named based on their origin, like Mandarin, Peking, or Hong Kong. And later, as more American farmers start to breed soybean on American soil, names after US presidents start to appear, like Lincoln, Madison, and Adams. To give soybean varieties the name of Confederate generals almost 100 years after the Civil War was a deliberate choice. These names appeal to white farmers' nostalgia for an imagined past. Considering these cultivars were bred to suit industrial farming, the nostalgia cloaked the disruption and exclusion brought by automated farming equipment. These names also played a part in shunning black farmers in the South. Together with discriminatory practice by federal agencies and private banks, the population of black farmers declined more than 90% from 1940s to the 80s. Additionally, soybean future entered the stock market in 1936 so that people who may have never seen a soybean plant can profit from its circulation. So soybean finally established roots in America by functioning less as food but more as a commodity within capitalism. Let's now recap the domestication process in America. First, it went through modernization, as its Asian background was conceptualized as something in the past, allowing white Europeans to modernize it, isolate it from its environment, and categorize it within Western scientific system. Soybean therefore played a part in colonizing the New World, where cultivation equals ownership, an equation distinctively different from indigenous understanding of the landscape. Next, soybean had to shed its cultural specificity and attach itself with American patriotism. Eating and growing soybean were framed as American acts. Its entanglement with the Asian bodies were neutralized and emphasis on nutritious value and chemical organization. And what eventually made soybean successful in American soil is its adaptability with industrial farming, controllability created by genetic modification, and its integration into the global trade. Soybean finally became legible in American consciousness through abstraction and scalability. The domestication of soybean in the US is a story about colonization, capitalism, and racism, but there have always been different voices. George Washington Carver understood soybean through its reciprocal relationship with the soil, and Mitchem advocated for soybean through eating, taste, the relationship with the human body. Its history also raises questions for the present. As China increasingly sources soybean from South America, what would happen when rainforests are converted into monocultural fields? What would happen to the 80 million acre of soybean fields in America? And how will farmers absorb this transition? And who will be left behind this time? I will leave it here. Okay, thank you.
So I think the panels I saw earlier kind of opened it up to a Q&A first, and I thought that was really great because we had some great questions. So maybe let's do that again. Anyone want to start? If we're tired because it's the end of the day, I can also start. But I just wanted to give you all a chance. Sounds like, okay, maybe I'll start with a question. Oh, there we go, yeah.
Hi, that was really fantastic. And what it did was also connect nation, empire, and home really beautifully. And I wondered if the three panelists would be interested in, talking about how they see those connections, the themes throughout the day.
Yeah, actually, and that completely is related to one of my questions. I'll just add it. Just the weaving together of sort of private and public worlds in all of yours. You know, you have like private gardens, you have public global industries, you have like family memory and public history. And yeah, I was also wondering, like, how do the plants help you kind of like make those leaps? So
I mean, we talked a little bit about this when we met as a panel on Zoom last week. And I mean, for me, the story of the Maycock aligns with some of the stories that we heard by panelists. I mean, there was food production, sophisticated food production happening here before this was named a nation state, right? There were many nations that had many different sophisticated, whether we want to call them agriculture or complex hunting and gathering, whatever the names are. And yet, we then supplanted those practices with, in part the story of soybeans could be told many times over with lots of other crops. And now we're at a point where we have to reclaim those foodways that are literally on the verge of extinction. And so that's part of what we talked about last week when we were together, and really appreciating each other's work.
Yeah, I mean, I think I got lucky in some sense that like all of the plants I was encountering were filtered through rats, because rats really don't care if it's a public or a private space, right? Rats don't care if it's a scientific plant. They don't care if it's a food plant. They don't care if it's a trash plant. If they can use it, they will take it. And so I definitely don't want to say that there's not a distinction between public and private space, but I think in the way that like a lot of the taxonomies that get applied to plants and natural history more broadly are presented as rigid, but are in reality extremely permeable. This idea of domestic, private versus public, national, or even international are not as bounded as we would like to say that they are.
I'm not sure if this is like answering the question correctly, but I guess it just goes back to the idea of following the plants. So in following the plants, that you uncover all of these stories, and you start to like weave together stories of different scale. And I don't know, like the process of working on this, it kind of feel like picking out like musical notes from like a bunch of noise, and like what you're trying to do is to like, I don't know, compose the music in some way, like out of all of like these informations. And I think like especially in history, like you sort of have a like in people's mind there are like a major theme that's going on, but there are also all of these other voices. So just yeah.
Any other questions? Do you want to? Yeah. Yes.
I thank you. First off, I'm struggling to make this question in my head, but there is something so symbolic with the soybean and gender roles that, like, I think most of the speakers in this room would have something to say about. But I was struck immediately by the things currently happening in our government, where we're flipping the food pyramid to be, protein and whole milk and blah, 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 blah. And I don't know, I was vegan for a while. People were like, oh, like soybeans are so bad for you. Like they increase your estrogen and it's just terrible. And so I don't know, it's so interesting to see this long lineage of the same arguments being made over and over again. Again, I don't really have a question here, but I just think it is such an important piece to bring into this and can relate to most of the things that have been said today.
Thank you. Yeah, I kind of want to add on to that. Like something that sort of struck me is that taste is such a constructed thing. Like in America, like there is a taste for meat, I guess. And there are like people are refusing soybean because it's a plant, but it's so constructed. And I think part of with the work that Mitchem was trying to do is trying to flip that cultural construction, but she failed. Yeah,
Well, I have a question for you about this, which is, soybeans are being produced in China for 3,000 years before they're really take hold here. What was production like there? Because it strikes me that there's something that changed about production when it became an Americanized version that's now being exported. But what was it like in the first 3,000 years?
I think Chinese people planted like more sort of mixed. I like went through some of like the Asian farming books in China. It usually describe it as being planted with other things together, like weeds, millet. Sometimes it's planted within forests, and people just like pick things up. And also the soybean that we have now is heavily genetic modified. The Asian species of soybean, I think people just like the seed pod does not open up at the same time. Like people have to wait until the seed pod open and the beans are dropped on the ground and picking them up. That's how you like harvest them. Instead of now, it's very heavily mechanized.
Questions? Well, I have a question about kind of home being associated with unrecognized and undervalued labor, whether it's like women or immigrants, enslaved people, and I think for these reasons over the last few years, labor and care have become really salient topics in the field of landscape architecture, and now they're even more urgent because of the policies of the Trump administration. And I'm wondering, in what ways do you find your research responding to these contemporary conversations, if at all?
Yeah, I guess I'll start. I struggle to like articulate this exactly because like I'm really hesitant to say like, oh, I have found a plant that could have been grown by a woman, which means I study the women here, you know? So I think that's why like the idea of like indexical relationships kind of works in my research. And because like we know that underrepresented people were a part of this household. We've known that for years. You know, my research isn't gonna like suddenly show up and make us like prove that they were there. But it's also like, as you're particularly at a site like Bartram's Garden where we have, I mean, just like books and books and books of their personal writing about these plants, from John and William, and we don't have anything from any of the women who lived there. You know, it is something to think about. Like, I find it hard to believe that, like, you know, John's wife and his daughters and his granddaughters wouldn't have also been like producing the farm. And then again, like they bought the land from prior like Swedish settlers, so they weren't like immediately occupying it after the Lenape, but like it was not that long at all, right? So like there were also these indigenous foodways that were very much a part of Pennsylvania. And again, like Philadelphia like was built using enslaved labor. This was absolutely that time period. So yeah, I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, no, I think I think, and Tessa, in your case, it just struck me as you were talking about just even the process, just how much labor is the process of like tracing these seeds. I mean, and it reminds me a lot of, sorry, and I want you to answer the question too, but it does remind me a lot of sort of, this like the history that is held in sort of the memories of like elders and communities, like who just really dedicate their life to uncovering these family trees and telling these stories, and it's really important. It's like they're public historians, but are often really not recognized, and usually they're Black and Indigenous. And so anyway, it just struck me that what you were describing was that work, and it was very, very meticulous.
Yeah, and a bit mysterious. And you have to be uncomfortable with not knowing everything or not knowing it as precisely as we might if we framed the question a little differently. Like the reason that Courtney Street can't find the right Fanny Johnson is because it doesn't seem like any of the family members of any of the Fanny Johnsons understood what that squash meant to her. Right? They don't remember that there was, my great aunt or my grandma grew squash that was really meaningful. Because maybe it wasn't the most, when she shared those seeds with Weaver, she said, "I'm not sure who else is going to grow these. Will you please grow them?" It was a very explicit set of instructions. And so even with our own communities, as the pressure for modernization and moving in and just all the pressures of regular life, that knowledge can be diminished. I think the gender question, like in some ways, looking at the arc of seeds, which is intimately tied to the arc of our nation, right? When the first speaker put up the quote about the most beneficial thing you can do is to introduce a new plant. I mean, there was a very explicit and intentional distribution of seeds. Congress distributed seeds under the label of their, congressional stamp all throughout the country, and asked, planters to send back that data. And the seed trade association was really the first industrial lobby group that we had as in the United States of America, like actively lobbying for Congress to stop sending out free seeds because that domain could be privatized. But for the entire history of agriculture, women have been the seed keepers. And you see this, I appreciate the scaffolding that you gave us of like modernize, Americanize, commercialize, because that's essentially what we've done with the seed industry. And we've taken this practice of care and relationship of seed keeping and trading and sharing, and we've modernized it and privatized it and wholly Americanized it through the patent and intellectual property system and commercialized it. And so there's a way in which we've taken the gendered domain of seeds and we've flipped it. But in doing so, we have done an incredible disservice to the seeds themselves. They're now stored in banks and privatized and enclosed under plant variety protections, and sometimes, lost forever. And so, there's a lot to say about gender here, and home, and travesty. Because the way it was always done was thought to be not, who knows? Who knows exactly? Lots of things.
When did that Seed Trade Association, you said, what time frame?
It's like 1904. It's 1900 something.
Do you all have any burning questions for each other?
Yeah, I kind of have a question for you. Something that's really interests me about your work is you mentioned that the taste and growing them is before knowing them through genetic scientific study, I guess. I don't know. I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit, because for me, when I was doing the research, I was very struck by how important taste and food is for people like Yamekin, and that's a very different way of knowing compared to, I guess, the Western way of rational thinking mind and the way of knowing. I just wonder what your perspective on that.
Yeah. The interesting thing about taste in a landrace too, if you think about a landrace planting as a community level planting, not only, I mentioned in the presentation, resistance to biotic and abiotic factors, but if the four of us are in a community and we plant this landrace, well, maybe your family likes the green squash, and maybe my family likes the more acorn types, and your family really wants the spaghetti, right? So it allows for all of these different kinds of tastes within a community too. The first move for our research collaborative is not genetics, because our goal is to get to know this squash and to revitalize it within the communities that are responsible for gifting it to the world. And if we were, and they don't want us to do genetics first, right? There is, I'm currently working with a student who is Nanticoke and studying ecology and evolutionary biology at Princeton, and is involved in the garden project and is working with some of the corns that we have. And he really wants to do some genetic analysis in historic. That feels really appropriate. He will do it. He will build a bridge between the faculty he's working with and the elders from their community, and think about what does their community want to know about the corn, what do they need to know about the corn, and what aren't they interested in. And there's already been methodological discussion about how the elders will have a voice in that conversation with the thesis advisor. And my collaborators in the community are, the work of genetics and testing and science has not been kind to them generally. And so it's not their first move, although there are things that they're curious about. But they want to know the plant first, so we don't say, where we talk about it as a person. Oh, I would like to introduce you to this squash, right? And so all of those moves, they're very curious about knowing more, but like in the right time. And it's not, the first step is not that.
I was curious, Cleo, how has how did the sort of your experiment go? So you grew them and harvested?
As Tessa mentioned, thank you. I don't know if Andy is here, but Andy took one home and cooked one. I took one home, and then the undergrad who's responsible for the garden harvested a bunch of them over the summer. And the squash grew into the sidewalk, so it definitely took over a little bit, but it was very cool.
And so you were able to kind of see different tastes, different kind of...
Yeah, I personally was not able to taste different ones, but I was watching them grow. They were like growing in the shrubs. And I had one that was similar to zucchini. It was a white one. Yeah.
My undergrads grow whatever we decide not, or eat whatever we decide not to grow seeds from. And so we've had like tastings in the kitchens on campus. Some are not good. Some are not good.
Which ones are not good? Like... are there any phenotypical sort of like characteristics?
I don't
not
have
at
that
all?
pattern yet. Any the ones that look like spaghetti squash in there are not good. They don't have the sweetness of real spaghetti of the spaghetti squash that I am used to. But we're dealing with an incredibly atrophied landrace, and so there's a lot that a landrace that was sorted out even by a very, known a seed keeper, a Quaker seed keeper who works on indigenous seeds. His impulse was separate it, categorize it, and so we're having to undo.
And so the idea is like as you sort of like undo that, they might become tastier.
We too will make selections, right? We too are seed keepers of this variety. And so we too will decide, we will eventually pattern which ones are the ones that don't taste as good. And then we will not save the seeds from those.
While I have the mic, I'll just keep going. I'm really interested in the sort of communities that all of you have talked about around seeds and plants, whether it's the rats and the people living in that building, whether it's indigenous communities, or whether you're looking at how politics plays into all of this. And I don't know exactly what the question is, but I'm curious about using seeds as community, and maybe with climate change, communities sort of facing change, but also plants facing change, how you might see this kind of study moving forward. What is people's tangible connection to these seeds and plants as we face maybe more environmental turmoil?
I'm not sure how to answer this question, but I thought about right now America has 80 million acre of croplands that's dedicated to soybean. It's not used to be like that this way. I think in before the 50s, I want to say it's more diverse. We have America have more species of beans that's growing. I don't know. Maybe this is opportunity to grow something else.
Not to overplay the value of a landrace framework here, but we're so used to stable varieties. I want to grow so my favorite tomato is the pineapple tomato. I want to grow the pineapple tomato. I want it to look like the pineapple tomato every single year. And so I'm going to save my seeds from my pineapple tomato and plant that. That causes a genetic bottlenecking, and it doesn't give us the resilience that it needs to switch and change, right? And so plants that know their place and their people for a long time and have evolved to deal with the stressors of the place are the better things to grow, rather than getting, the pineapple tomato seeds from Seed Savers Exchange in Iowa, right? And so the idea of the landrace is that it evolves and changes over time, and not all of those strains are going to persist because the environment changes. Some exciting work that I like around this is by Chris Smith out of the Utopian Seed Project in Asheville. He has a book that's forthcoming that he just deposited last month. But he has kind of a primer from an article in The Guardian maybe a year and a half ago called it's something like, if you love heirloom seeds, let them change. And part of the response to, the kind of the privatization and patenting of seeds has been a kind of almost an equal and opposite response of heirloom seed keepers, that we don't want to lose these varieties and we want them to stay the same. But in fact, that's not how, it's almost like a response from, it's almost like a predetermined response, when in fact the real way to be with plants is to let them change a little bit every year. And now we need them to change really, really, really quickly. But most of the communities that I work with that share seeds with us, they want their plants to change and adapt. It's not this kind of like pure idea.
Yeah. Yes, that's one. Sorry, I just.
So this is more of a statement than a question. So we started today by mentioning that part of the symposium today was kind of a quote unquote, like a commemoration of 1776 and the Declaration of Independence. And I think it's really fascinating how in 250 years, what did continental US look like, right? And sort of what have we done to the continent in 250 years? From a place that was managed by indigenous people to a place, if you remember the maps that we just saw of the soybean, so I live in Illinois now, and soybean is the major crop, corn is not. Soybean is the major crop there. And when you saw the maps, it was like almost all green, that we have created monocultures in the United States, and a significant part of the central, the Midwest and the central part of the US is just one big giant monoculture. It's either soybeans or corn. But how dramatically we have just impacted this entire continent and changed over what was once an extremely rich, biodiverse nation to a nation that is not. So I guess I do sort of have a question, which is, where are we heading, right? Where are we heading? Because Tessa, you guys are trying to sort of reimagine, kind of revitalize these ancient seeds, but to do that, you need land to do it on. And there's not that much land left to do these things on. And then we also, are looking at sort of the monoculture. I love the rats, just by the way. I love the life-size picture of the rats up there. Woke us up. We've also had the impact of not just kind of these monocultures, but also the kind of invasives that then are part of that, which there are insects and pests, etc. So anyway, I'm just sort of like, where are we heading now into the future?
So in a class that I teach, it's called Saving Seeds. The final paper prompt is, do seeds need saving? And everyone answers yes. Yes, seeds need saving. The right answer is no. Seeds are going to be fine eventually. Like, we need saving. We need the seeds because we need to be saved. And I feel like, where are we heading? We are not heading anywhere good. But there will be an after us. And yeah, that's all I know.
So last year I taught a class here at Penn, and at the end I asked the students to come up with strategies, design strategies. It's a landscape class, so thinking about what to do next is sort of like our thing. Like just critiquing things is not enough. I think some of the students' projects are were really interesting. Like we have proposal of like seed libraries, sort of like these tiny library on the roadside, but people put seeds in. We also have like small community gardens, and we have all of students have all of these really small, intimate type of project, and I sort of feel like that's something that we probably should be headed to in the future. Yeah.
This is a really interesting question because, as archaeologists, we think backwards so much, and I don't know. Certainly, I don't feel like any strong compulsion that Bartram's Garden should be returned to the state it was in the 18th century, because that was also a construction that at the time was a major change. And I don't want to speak for the Bartram's Garden Association and everything they're doing, but they are doing a combination of planting plants that might have been grown there, but they're also the site of the Sankofa Community Farm. They do a lot of community programming. I mean, they're in Southwest Philly, so it's a predominantly Black neighborhood. Anyone who lives sort of in the area can attend any programming there for free, and frankly, I think that's probably a better use of that space than it would be to try to recreate a 1780 something model of the garden. So yeah, I don't know. In terms of that's not an answer to your question, but I think the answer is maybe, I think certainly trying to recreate a moment in time is not the answer, right? It has to be something that serves the need of people as we go forward.
Yeah. Any last questions? I think seeds don't need saving, and who else doesn't need saving? Rats. They'll be fine. All right, so
The rats
we'll
are
end
gonna be fine.
Rats and seeds will be just gallivanting across the planet, very happy. Anyway, I think we're past time, so thank you all.
That was a great panel, and I agree with Banu. I think all three of the panels did touch on all three of the themes. So it was nice to see that kind of atemporal movement of ideas. But I just wanted to conclude with just a few things. First of all, thank you to our audience for being here. I know that we've had different groups moving throughout the day, but it's so great to have your questions and your thoughts. But I thought I would channel a little Maria Teresa Alves and just do a little naming and a little reading one at a time to thank all of you who participated up here today. Banu Subramaniam, Rick McCourt, Chantel White, Rosalind Lapierre, Jessica Varner, Maria Teresa Alves, Chelsea Armstrong, Tony Sorrentino, Vanessa Grossman, Jared Farmer, Tessa Desmond, Ali Mitchem Hansen, Shurui Zhang, Azzurra Cox. Thank you to all our speakers. 2 more names right here. We would not be here without them. Liz Vanderwerken, Laura Knut. Thank you all so very much. And we have a nice reception out there, but I know it's cold in there, so you're welcome to grab whatever you like, mingle in here if you like. Thank you so much. What? Catherine Sievett. Thank you.